Everybody, welcome to Webinar Wednesday. My name is Marcel van Rossum. I'm the Chief Trend of Supply Chain Media. I'm also the Editor-in-Chief of Supply Chain Movement, quarterly magazine in Europe, but also a huge LinkedIn group and also a bi-weekly newsletter, websites, and so forth and so on. I'm also the co-founder of Supply Chain Companions. We'll talk about it later. In the next 30 minutes, we have a live webinar. We talk about tariffs. We talk about GenAI. And the main topic is rapid strategic scenario building for supply chain with AI. So that's the very hot topic as of today. And next to me, I have two experts on this. You see me on the left-hand side without a glass. And in the middle, you see Marcel van Rossum. He's also co-founder of Supply Chain Companions. A lot of experience in the medtech environment. So welcome, Marcel.
Thank you, Martijn.
And you have also be a general manager of business, so you have done it all in supply chain, haven't you?
Yes, like you mentioned, I spent the majority of my time in the medtech industry, but I've also seen the Philips business. I've seen other businesses in the paper industry, oil industry, and I'm glad to have this conversation because in 30 years of being in supply chain, the tools you have today are completely different than the tools we had 30 years ago.
Yeah, we'll talk about it in depth later on in this webinar. And next to Marcel, we have Carlos Cordon. He is he's professor at IMD, next to his position as co-founder of Supply Chain Companions. So you have a background originally in IT a long time ago, and you are using it right now. Maybe I can explain what have you been doing, what your experience is.
Yeah, so before being an academic, I was a CIO of a company where we manufacture cables, and I was also a consultant, an IT consultant. So in that sense, I've been always a little bit of a kind of freak. And funnily enough, I can even say that it was many decades ago in university. Actually, I had a very strange seminar course. Actually, I obtained the highest grade, which was called contextual grammar, which was exactly the predecessor of the AI systems that we have today that interpret the context in order to provide grammar. So it was many years ago, and I've been working on that area a lot about supply chain. How can we use precisely all these new developments in supply chain? And I think that we have passed probably January this year or last part of the last year, we passed a tipping point, and which means basically now we can use it widely. Yeah. And that's precisely what we're to talk about today.
And interestingly enough, I've studied operations research a long time ago. I've never applied these algorithms, although I know them. I've been working most of my life in the publishing business in supply chain. But now you can ask these GenAI tools about these algorithms, and I recognize them again from a long time ago. And it's now very easy. So we will talk about it. It's easy on one side. It's also hard on the other side. So they will talk about it. Some practical things. This webinar will be recorded and will be made available on YouTube. And the PDF will also be made available via our website. So you have, as an audience, you have the opportunity to ask questions. So on the right-hand side, you see the chat functionality. So you can use the chat functionality. Everybody can see it, and you can answer it. Most of the time, the most common question is this webinar recorded? Yes, it is. So if you want real in-depth questions, please use the Q&A functionality on the right-hand side. It's one below the chat. These small text bubbles. And then, if these questions are in line of the conversation I will be having with Marcel and Carlos, I will ask them right away. If not, we have a Q&A almost at the end of the webinar, 55 minutes in. And if you have still questions, there's an extra opportunity to sit down with the three of us. We will be sitting in a virtual lounge, and it looks like this. So when you sit at table one, a Zoom meeting will be popping up in this environment. So it's quite easy. So you can have a conversation right after this if you have some more questions. So basically, as of now, we will put off our camera. Why? Because you can enlarge the screen and you have a better view of the slide. So, Carlos and Marcel, you can also click off your camera and then people can enlarge the screen. All right. Before we go into that, maybe Marcel, you can explain Supply Chain Companions. Can you explain a bit more what you're doing?
Yeah, so Supply Chain Companions brings together a group of very experienced supply chain leaders. We come from a variety of industries. And we cover also a variety of supply chain disciplines, from manufacturing to planning to deliver. And as you show here, We in this matrix, we work a lot on the strategic side, but where needed, we also help companies from a tactical or an operational perspective. But quite often we say we start with the supply chain strategy. Either we connect that to the business strategy, or if you have a good supply chain strategy, we say, okay, we have seen it, we have done it, we understand what it means to implement the supply chain strategy into results and into execution. And last but not least, and that's also what we do today, as companions, we are staying relevant with having the knowledge about what's going on in the world of supply chain and beyond in relation to business strategy.
Yeah, and when you look at the header down below, strategic thinking with AI, and that's basically the topic of today, and maybe that's also something to mention. So, as of lately, Supply Chain Companions has done a lot with AI, and we'll talk about it in depth later on. So, Carlos, this is an overview of a German scale-up scraping the internet of the transcriptions of quarterly earning calls by Fortune 500 companies, mostly US companies. So this is what the CEOs and CFOs are talking about. And the further right you go, the more phrases are mentioned in these calls. And as of the beginning of COVID, since the last 5 years, supply chain was always on the right-hand side. So a lot of them were mentioned. But since the last quarter, out of nowhere, practically, from upper left into upper right, tariffs is the major topic. So that's what they are talking about. But also the other topics are mentioned. So, Carlos, you are having a lot of interviews lately with CEOs and supply chain officers. When you look at this, what is your reflection when you are thinking back on these interviews?
So in these interviews, one of the interesting things that was that CEOs were saying, we need to be much more thinking about risks and opportunities as a business, not as a supply chain, not as a particular function. And the idea was basically, yes, these tariffs and these changes are having a huge impact and a huge risk, but at the same time, they present huge opportunities. And then the other thing that to me was very, very interesting is that many of them, even last year, before we had the DeepSeek moment in January, many of them, they were talking about AI first. Can we develop a lot of things using AI? So I think that basically when you see there the Trump administration coming in, there is a lot of new tariffs, there's a lot of volatility. And that means from a CEO perspective, we need to take into account that these are not only risks, but also opportunities. And what I would say is that it confirms a little bit now precisely you see these agentic AI, DeepSeek, and AI effectively being keywords. So I think that there is a huge push for let's think about the whole business, let's think about the AI, and let's think about risks, and let's think about opportunities that these might represent.
Tell me, what is the DeepSeek moment for people who don't know that?
Oh, yeah, sorry. So the DeepSeek moment was in January this year. Suddenly, there was something called DeepSeek out of nowhere. And suddenly, there was a shock. And the shock was the following. Until then, basically, it was thought that AI, particularly GenAI, was a game for big companies, for the Googles, for the Microsofts, for OpenAI, investing billions. And it will require a lot of money. And therefore, the barriers to entry were big. DeepSeek created a shock because they didn't need huge computers. They didn't need so much investment. It was said maybe it's not as much as small as they say, but certainly we are talking that before it was only the Googles and the Amazons and the Microsoft and the OpenAIs of this world. Now we are saying, well, medium-sized companies, actually, they can create their own and they can actually share it because DeepSeek, that was the interesting thing. It was open source. So anybody can download that. In fact, I have DeepSeek in a container just for me. And they created in my organization, they created that. So we can have that. So that means suddenly we go from we need a bigger scale to be able to do that to we don't need the bigger scale, which means a threat for big companies.
Yeah. And also agentic AI is also in yellow, upper left, also quite new. And we will talk about it later in what the Supply Chain Companions has developed. So maybe you can explain agentic AI, what is it, before we get into the definition of AI itself?
So I think that is relatively simple. Agentic AI means, and this was the big evolution that the people was expecting from basically a kind of website like DeepSeek or like ChatGPT, that you ask basically what is the best way to travel from, let's say, from Amsterdam to Bologna. It will recommend flights and so on, but it will not book the flights for you. So agentic is when now we have the possibility of asking the AI to do things for us. The typical one that is happening right now is, can AI, an agent, answer my emails automatically? You can think about the amount of emails that you receive, and you would say, oh, you know, all of those from this, I need to take an action. It's not basically I don't need to do anything, but this is the action I wanted to take. And agentic AI will be able to learn from your actions and answer that. And there's quite a lot of them. So think about that. It's not just receiving information, it's then doing something that is going to book, is going to receive something.
So before we go into deep, because we talk a lot about GenAI later on and large language models, you see it here, but AI is a big bubble, and beyond that, there's even data science. Zoom in, you have machine learning, and you can read it right here. You know, ChatGPT is a smaller part of AI. That's the GenAI part. In supply chain, we already used AI quite a lot with the linear regression, neural network, etc. So basically, that is something we have to understand, that in supply chain, some people say, oh, we are using already AI to some extent in advanced planning and scheduling. So is that a hurdle, or is that in favor for companies, Carlos?
So I always use one example. If you think about supply chain, we are the biggest users, I believe, in the world of Excel. And then the interesting thing, you go to any company, they have an ERP, maybe Oracle, maybe SAP, and on top of that, they use a lot of Excel. And you would say, is one or the other? I think it's both. We need the system for the whole enterprise that is doing that. And then the Excel is the kind of generic tool with which we can do quite a lot of different things. I think that here, what many AI applications that we have used for modeling, for planning, and so on, they are very good. They're very specialized. They don't do things like hallucination, things like that. When we go to the other extreme, to the other side, which is GenAI is technically a different thing, and it might make some mistakes. And this is where a lot of people I would say, concerned about that. The same way SAP or Oracle as an ERP is not going to make mistakes. You might make a mistake in an Excel spreadsheet. You introduce the wrong formula and things go wrong. So I think that we need to think about that. One is a very specific tool that we are using, very successful, and the other is a much more generic tool that we use in a lot of different settings. So I think these are two different applications of similar methodologies, but both we have been using. And this is why, exactly as you say, we have been using AI in supply chain for many years.
Yeah, I think in some way it's a hurdle in the sense that, you know, either we are thinking we are using it already for years in an advanced planning system on one hand, but, you know, the GenAI part, you know, large language model, we don't know yet how to use it, but we'll get to that point later on because of the tariffs, etc., the chaos that has been created. GenAI will have a purpose. Going to the tariffs, Marcel, you know, you have been working in the business in Philips, J&J, so you know this map. and since April 2nd, there was the first introduction. You see the large map, but later on, 10 days later, you see the US tariffs for Chinese goods going up to 145%. So if you look at this and you thinking back on your Philips and J&J days, what is your response to all this?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think this is a very interesting picture, Martijn, and if you make it tomorrow, it might change again.
Mm-hmm.
And today we talk about tariffs in relation to scenario planning, but in general, what you see within supply chain is that you're sometimes taken by surprise, and in this case, we're taken by surprise in terms of tariffs. But in my experience, for example, working for J&J, we had a great product. We were the number one in Japan. We were the, let's say, sole supplier in Japan for a long time for a certain product. And we were caught by surprise by a competition entering the market, where we were thinking they're coming 1 year later than expected. Another example, and then I come to my point, the other example is I lost a litigation in the Netherlands. I had a manufacturing site in the Netherlands. We were making the similar product. And within 8 weeks, we had to close a factory, which was supplying the whole world.
Mm.
Yeah. And throughout my career, what I've seen it's hard to make fast and confident strategic supply chain decisions, even with excellent teams. And I think that maybe brings us also to the point of this webinar. Today, we have different tools than we had 30 years ago, than we had 20 years ago, than we had 10 years ago. So yes, the tariffs is important now, and maybe in a few years we don't talk about tariffs. But what in general, what you see, I call it, there is an earthquake every so many months, and the earthquake can be a real earthquake, as I have experienced also with the earthquake in Japan and the impact on supply chains. The earthquake can be COVID. The earthquake is now tariffs, and there will be more earthquakes in the future. So, Carlos, what's your thinking here?
So I think that and you use in that sense a good image, because we were used to a very stable world. And in the last years, we go from one surprise to another. And it's not one surprise to another in the sense that we expected it, is that suddenly something totally out of the blue that never happened in the last 30 years, something happens and it surprises all of us. And I think in that sense that what we are going to face is basically a situation in which we need to be able to analyze many things very fast in a very short time. And it's totally unpredictable. I mean, if you arrive to say this is a scenario just 1 year ago, everybody in the C-suite would have told you, you're crazy, it will never happen. So I think that's a very important lesson in the sense of it's totally, as you say, unpredictable.
But yeah, if you look at this map, it's overly simplified, because look at the car manufacturers, the OEMs. U.S. car manufacturer, they order parts from all over the world, and now all of a sudden, you get higher import tariffs for parts from Germany or Japan going into the U.S. That's one thing. What I read this morning in a financial paper in the Netherlands, now as a way to make it easier, or make it less difficult for American manufacturers, that they will introduce credits to make sure, okay, it's not tariff on tariff on tariff when you have parts and sub-assemblies and then moving into US. So they are introducing credits. So basically they will have the main tariffs, the highest one, but you will lose the extra one because you have tariffs of parts. So basically, as a result, as a domino effect, a second order effect, they come up with new kind of rulings. So what does it mean, Carlos, when you look at this? Because you think you can measure and model the supply chain globally, and then a new model is coming up, or a new rule of credits is coming in that makes it more unpredictable and complex.
So I think precisely that's the challenge that we face today. We need to be able to model that. And the answer is, if we use traditional models, even traditional AI, we are not going to be able to do that. Can we do that using GenAI? Well, the answer is yes. And in that sense, it's very important also to say it's not going to be extremely accurate. So it's not going to be something I would say, oh, it's the last cent right, but it's going to be approximately right. And when we're talking about tariffs of 145 versus tariff of 20% or 10%, we want to be approximately right, and we want to do that fast, and we want to analyze a lot. And then all of these is something that just to know what could happen, and all this, what some people call second order effect, are there. Just let me put the other example that now everybody's concerned. What if suddenly many Chinese manufacturers, they cannot deliver products or components into the US, and they flood with a lot of products at a cheap price in the other markets? Suddenly, a company that thought it's not going to affect me, I don't have a lot of market share in the US. Oh, but my goodness, all of these Chinese manufacturers, suddenly, where are they going to put their products? And we see that actually in the car industry in Europe.
Yeah, that's the China shuffle. So products meant to be for Europe is going to the US, and products meant to be for the US is going to Europe. So it's going to be redirected. But now, even when you look at the Japanese, there was a news item this morning. You mentioned it, Marcel, that Nintendo, they will launch their new Switch that will be very lucrative, but that will change the whole game, isn't it, Marcel?
Yeah, well, that was indeed the news of today in a financial paper in the Netherlands, that Nintendo is going to launch their Switch 2 for the ones in the gaming It seems to be a very important product, and
That's
a
big.
lot of,
That's big.
it is big, and a lot of people are already, let's say, pre-ordering the product. And now Nintendo is facing, okay, what do we do with our pricing, especially in the US, where their competitor Sony with PlayStation already increased their price. So Nintendo currently seems to, let's say, keep the price at the level they have. But then if you read the article a little bit further, you understand what they are doing. They have built up a huge inventory, which has most probably be already in the US before the tariff hits them. And they first try to make their allowance and their market share. But they are also scratching their head about, okay, but what if this Switch 2 is a big success, and we need to keep supplying from
Yeah.
the current supply chain infrastructure which we have built up.
Yeah.
And to that point, I think for one of the things these days is that the slowest company today is the one who is thinking the slowest. And that is maybe an interesting part also to have that conversation with Carlos. We do have different ways of really being able to start thinking faster, and faster means seeing scenarios before you have your first coffee break and have an understanding about what that could impact on your business. And the other thing, Martijn and Carlos, I want to make a remark on is that we talk a lot about supply chain, but it is becoming a one conversation between the business strategy and the supply chain strategy. You can't see it as two separate conversations anymore, because the moment you have this kind of conversations about the tariffs and what are we going to do with prices, you immediately hit the business part of your total business. Are we able to increase the prices? What's the price elasticity of my product? The first 10% I might go up, nothing happens with my market share. If I go up another 20%, I might lose market share. Okay, so this is the kind of things where the supply chain leaders of today will get a lot of questions from the C-suite, and often they are part of the C-suite. But this makes the job also very interesting. Carlos, I'm interested in your perspective here.
So I think that you're absolutely right. It's one of those things. So my observation has been discussing with quite a lot of top management the last weeks, basically. Many of them were basically waiting. They were expecting that nothing will happen. Some of them were, I would say, hoping that it was basically a negotiation tactic and that the tariffs will never materialize. Now, what we realize that the tariffs are materializing, and then suddenly a lot of companies are caught up in surprise. And I always say, it's a little bit like, oh my goodness, what do we do now? And we need to analyze so many things we don't know where even to start with. You are a global company, and then it's basically, we have thousands of products, a lot of product families. We have a lot of manufacturing places, a lot of suppliers in a lot of places, and it's like, oh my goodness, what do we do now? And what you say is precisely, we need to do that very fast. Why very fast? Because some strategies might be good in the short term. As you know, many companies, they started to pile up stock in the US in advance of the tariff. Some others are not. And then it's like, oh my goodness, and where are the opportunities? So we are very, very, I would say, slow in thinking and slow in thinking about the opportunities. I remember when the tariffs started, one company in the US, they said, we increased our sales by 300%. It was like, what's going on? Oh, people want to buy used machines, not new machines, because of the tariffs. So I think that there is this fast thinking is, how do we make sure that we are farmers? Now we need to become hunters. We need to hunt the opportunity. And I think that for that, you need to be very fast. So I would agree with you very much, Marcel.
And if you look, and you said, Carlos, you mentioned already, you have to develop scenarios for the business purpose, but also for scenarios. So can you explain, and then we move into the AI field, what is the traditional way and what should we be doing now?
Yeah. So the scenario planning is something, it's a methodology that many decades ago Shell developed. And the idea was basically, if we look 10, 15, 20 years ahead, what is the likeliest scenario that we may have? And given the different scenarios, how we would react. So what you have here is actually work that was done in 2016. We published that even in a book. And we did that actually. We used the Shell methodology. We had the privilege of having some Shell executives and some executives from other companies participating. It took us something like 2 to 3 months to develop that, and it took us several weeks of synthesizing that, and we published that. Now, the interesting thing is that it was looking 15 years ahead. Now, that means the traditional way of doing that, it takes weeks of executives to develop that. So if we would say, oh, the US is putting some tariffs, and they're going to be there for sure for the next 10 years or for the next 5 years, is a proper way of dealing with that. If we see tariffs changing a lot over the next weeks, that means when we start to do the scenario planning exercise, after 1 week we need to restart again because the tariff changed, and after 1 week, so we cannot use that. And the only possibility will be to develop hundreds of scenarios, depending on who reacts how, and if this country puts this tariff, the other country is going to retaliate. What's going to happen? So this is a traditional one, and it doesn't work in today's circumstances. That's the big challenge.
Yeah, so basically, when you look at these 4 scenarios, it isn't quite as black and white. It is not, and it's going to change overnight. That some product groups will be moving from one section to another. So that's one thing. So you mentioned already, we have to use AI because all the scenarios, it goes beyond the 4. So what should we do, and how should we start?
But GenAI is able to do, and that's very important, is able to do quite a lot of things for you very fast, but you need to think about the following. And AI is very good if you know which question to ask. And that's precisely what we need to do. So can we use AI to create, for example, 100 plus scenarios? The answer is yes. It can create a lot of scenarios in a few minutes. Why do we need hundreds of them? Well, think about that. What we tend to use is we use scenarios that people, experts, they believe they're going to happen. But then when you go to supply chain, you need to go a little bit more granular. Yes, we know what a scenario is. They're going to be tariffs between the US and China. But are these tariffs going to be 10%, 40%, 100%, 145? And by the way, we have exceptions to the tariffs, exactly as you mentioned now. Some products for the car industry are different. So you might need to create many more in order to analyze the situation for your particular company and your particular product. So then what we do is we use one GenAI to create these scenarios. We use another one to analyze the opportunities and the risks given the supply chain strategy. And I emphasize that because we don't use the same GenAI. It's not like just going to ChatGPT and saying, we ask this, all of this. We use some of them, and there is a lot of different AI, and every one of those, they have a specificity about what they're good at. So what we're doing is let's generate a lot of scenarios. Let's later on analyze the consequence of those scenarios for the supply chain of the company. And we need to understand the supply chain of the company, and GenAI needs to have the information about that. And then basically to get some recommendations. Under the scenario, these will be the recommendations. That will be the options that we have. And finally, what we can do is say, okay, once we analyze so much, and you will say it's a lot of analysis, fortunately, it's GenAI doing that for us, can we look at the robustness of a certain strategy? And we can look at different things that we can do and test all of them against hundreds of scenarios. Not all of them are going to be good, but some of them are going to be good under those current scenarios, and some of them are not. So that allows us very fast to analyze many more scenarios than the traditional methodology.
And you also explained it a few weeks ago to me, using DeepSeek, they come up with, things you didn't thought about. And, and then that makes it interesting to see that, you have to think widely with all kind of possibilities, and that's creating a lot of scenarios, exponentially, I would say. And then GenAI will filter it to say, okay, the likelihood and etc.
Yes. So one of the things that is interesting, and this is why I like DeepSeek, but now I would say many of them are evolving as we speak very fast. But many of them, DeepSeek, what I like about that, it was providing the reasoning. Yep. Why I'm recommending that and so on. It was even debating with itself. I remember when we talk about that, I remember that a few weeks ago, DeepSeek said, this is the scenario. However, if the US administration does that, which is a possibility, then this is what will happen. And however, is this. So that provides the opportunity to understand and to elaborate even more. So this is why it's important, because sometimes what happens, there are what many people would call second order effects of these tariffs that we immediately don't think about, but absolutely AI can detect some of them. Now, I would say one thing also. It's very important that we need to verify, we need to add our knowledge, and we need to verify that things that are there make sense.
Yeah.
Why I'm saying that, remember that the GenAI is trained with a lot of different information from a lot of different places. We need to train this specifically for our purpose, but sometimes there is some, I would say, information that is biased. You could imagine people say, no, this is the best technology in the world. And maybe GenAI is going to say, I might recommend that, and you know that this technology is not working. So this is where you need this experience in order to say, this is what is appropriate, and particularly is appropriate for my company.
Yeah. So I read an article by your colleague from IMD, that's Howard Yu. He's talking about, he created a matrix about urgency, but also infrastructural readiness for this kind of purpose. And maybe, like you see right here, you have created with the supply chain companions a framework how to develop it, because like you mentioned, it's not just asking DeepSeek or whatever. It's more complicated like this. You, on the upper left side, you have the publicly available content, and you can use in your contained environment with all kind of GenAI kind of applications. And then you see that, well, the agents will ask different kind of engines certain questions, and then you come up with the AI powered data consolidation. Maybe you can explain a bit more. So on the right hand side, you see the experts input, and on the left hand side you see the publicly available content, but also internal data.
Yeah. So basically, this is it basically shows the architecture of different AI applications, different Gen AI that we use. One is basically the collection of the information from the web. ChatGPT and many others do that, and actually there's one by Gemini that is particularly that. Then what we have is basically we have the situation that we try to put the company data, and that's private data. And this is very important. This is why I was explaining that we use a container. We don't want that data to go out. And we don't want the AI, the generic AI, to learn from that. So this is why we put that in a container. Those two information, basically, we consolidate that in order to have a kind of data store where we have all the data we are going to use in order to analyze that. It's very important to have the data. And many companies have a problem. I always say, in a joking mode, but it's not a joke, the most difficult job today in supply chain is the master data.
Yeah.
Because it takes a lot of effort and it looks like it doesn't provide a lot of mileage. Actually, it's very, very important. Then we have on the right side, we have what we call the AI powered generator model. We need to have one model that basically generates the scenarios. And it's also relatively different per company because of your products, because of the situation. Just allow me to go to something very, very specific. There is something called the HSO code, which is, in the case of the US, is what drives the tariffs. And it's something that people is playing. They didn't pay a lot of attention. Is this device a computer or is this device hardware? And the tariff might change. So this is why it becomes very important to try to understand that. Then we put that together with some models about strategic intelligence, and then we create something else, which is a user interface. So we deliver the analysis and the advice in a way that fits with the user needs, because it's not the same if you are using that to simulate the scenarios about outsourcing, insourcing, where to locate things, or if you are looking about scenarios or shall we do maybe some more products. There is one. I see on one the comment, there is one company that said we move our wrinkle supply materials to Ireland from China. Absolutely. The challenge is there going to be tariffs from Ireland? Is the tariff from China going to go down dramatically in some time? And quite often you would like to analyze all of this and to have a user interface that provides that even in a graphical way. Yeah. So the interesting thing about this is that although it looks a little bit complex, it's not so complex, but you realize that you need, in that sense, to invest on developing that. Even Marcel, you are not a very, very technical guy in general, but even you were very much understanding the concept. Did I explain that in a way that you would say, Carlos, and even people without a very deep knowledge of AI would understand that? What do you think, Marcel?
No, absolutely. I mean, Carlos I call Carlos the architect of this whole model, and we have been using it right now for a few companies. And the concept is relatively easy, but what's behind it is very intelligent. And it helps again. So maybe Martijn, we can go a little bit into there's all kind of different scenarios. So it doesn't matter which scenarios you choose, but what we do with a customer in general is, okay, in the industry you're in, what are the typical kind of scenarios you would like to, let's say, run through this model? Yeah. And here you see an example of one of the colleague professors of Carlos, Richard Baldwin from IMD Business School. And he has defined here 6 different scenarios. This one we have been using for a company in cosmetics, but we are now currently working with another company which is in the equipment for a wide range of outdoor activities, typical consumer products. And we have a slightly different scenarios defined with them. And based on the type of industry you're in, you can go into different type of scenarios. And it is relatively easy to use. But see it as a starting point. Because why are we doing this? Not because it is AI. It is because we want to have fast insights, because we want to understand what are the potential mitigations. And I see also on the chat, one of the people reacting, yes, there is also short-term tactical actions to be taken. Yeah. But if you take these actions, what's the consequence of it? What's the impact of it? So it's about speed and smart decision making.
Yeah. So one thing, I also tested it with a global crop protection company last week. So we run publicly available data through this engine, and within half an hour we got the response, and it was a 50-page, so 50 page of a document with the different kind of scenarios, also the recommendations, etc., etc. So I've run through this document briefly in 45 minutes with the global supply chain executive. And this person was very much positively surprised because one of the big companies, consultancy firms, is also in there. And we just, delivered it within 30 minutes. And she said, yes, all the major things are there. And some of them are things we haven't discussed yet during our conversation with its global consultancy firm. And basically, you can run way faster. And maybe it's a second opinion for this consultancy firm. And maybe they will develop the similar things. But we need to speed up. That's one thing. And I do agree that you have this kind of scenarios, but we have to run faster. If Carlos, we talked about scenarios. If you look at that a bit deeper,
yes,
these is one scenario. So how do you explain this? What should you take out of this?
Yeah. So this is GenAI. Basically, what we did was to say, okay, this is one scenario, if you remember one of the 6. But now we need to go deeper. And this was for the specific companies we were saying, these are basically I was basically saying, okay, so now we have this specific company is in the fast-moving consumer goods, and they, by the way, they have the biggest markets in US, European Union, UK, and Canada. They have also China and Russia, and then they have also factories in these and these and these countries. So I go deep into try to say, this is the factories, this is where they are sourcing, these are the things where they are delivering. So it's already starting to look at what are the things that are going to happen given where we have the factors and where we have our most important markets. So what does it mean? That it means that, for example, here I was saying, extreme tariffs. Now we will run not one scenario, but probably 2 or 3 scenarios here, because one thing is a tariff of 50%, another thing is a tariff of 100%, another thing is a tariff of 0%. Which one is the one that's going to happen? We don't know. But now suddenly we can analyze the 3 scenarios out of 1 very fast. And this is why I use AI to start to look at what are the relevant scenarios. And as you see, even it's interesting because even I didn't know that, but it looks like there are some chemicals that are sourced, and basically you need to comply with some specific regulations. There is some skin care products, and basically the Chinese hyaluronic acid is something that is not, in that sense, looks like there's a problem with that, so you cannot do certain things. So it's trying to take care of many of these things and try to simulate the scenarios that will make in that sense, quite a lot of reality check. And it is something that you would say, Carlos, no problem. I can do that. If I have 10 people in my company doing that for a couple of weeks, they will be able to do that. Yes, absolutely. And then they will do that. But this is basically something that is done literally in minutes. And then we use every scenario to deliver more scenarios that we need to analyze that from a geopolitical point of view are not so different, but from a supply chain point of view is very different at tariff 50 or 100 or 10%.
Yeah, and if you look at one scenario in one certain region, then you go exponential, because then you will
That's
create
right.
different kind of lanes and different kind of supply chains, and you mentioned it.
Yeah. So this is why, if you remember, the first scenario was basically a kind of the definition was relatively 1930s style and so on. But that the scenario could see, we might have basically NAFTA versus EU versus Asia, creating these blocks, or it could be China separated from the rest of Asia, or it could be those three blocks versus the rest of the world. So what happens is, in that sense, of course, not all of these scenarios make sense for every company, because some companies might say, well, we are not in China or we are not in the US, so that doesn't make much sense for us. But then basically is where you say, okay, which ones are the combination of those scenarios? And as you said, suddenly you end up with a lot of different combinations, 10, 20, even 100 or even more. And then you say, how do I analyze so many? And then you need to use AI precisely to be able to do that. You use AI to develop the scenarios. You use a different AI or the same LLM, but with a different seeding, with a different information, with different, I would say, training in order to analyze the consequences of that.
And
So
and what we did also last week, we had two brewers, and one is the main focus is brewer one, but then we added, this is the main competitor, and all of a sudden, the GenAI tool came up. Your company is even better or worse comparing to this in certain lanes. So it's not only your look on the world of your company, but there are other companies in the same field, in the same market, and there are even adjacent ecosystems. So if you drink beer, you drink soft drinks, whatever. So that will also change, and that will multiply the different kind of scenarios.
Exactly, because then you need to take into account what are the reaction of competitors. Exactly as Marcel was saying. Marcel was saying that Sony increased the price, whereas Nintendo didn't. Now, one scenario is, Sony might increase the price, or they might decide not to. So these are two different scenarios that you might need to take into account, and you might want to explore in order to get better insights about what are the different actions that you could take.
So, Carlos, you mentioned also now Excel, and some companies are using supply chain network design tools like Ames, Lamasoft, and the likes. What is the purpose of this kind of tools, and are these tools ready for this, or are they to be used as an input or an output?
So we use these tools typically, and these are things that the company has developed. And then these are great tools. They are very granular. This is something that we need. We need to extract the information at the summary level, typically at the family product level, not SKU. If you think about these tools, they go to SKU level. They do a fantastic job of optimizing and so on. But here we want to take a little bit of information about trying to know what are the manufacturing places, where are the routes, what are, in that sense, what people will call the nodes in a model. And we might use that from Excel, or we might use that from Yamasoft or other software tools or the digital twins that the company has. The only challenge that we have is that we need to make sure that we extract the information in a way that is useful and that is not too detailed. Because at the same time, if you think about tariffs and so on, typically go per family of products. So that means going to the level of SKU, it doesn't provide much more information. So this is why we use these tools. In this case, we simulate that with an Excel spreadsheet. And I'm saying Excel spreadsheet because quite often, even what people do is they extract information from these tools and they put that in a presentable model by using an Excel. And then from them, we take the information and to model that into C, given that the scenario, we provide the input, that's what will happen, and then we see the output. That's basically the consequence of that. So in that sense, we integrate sometimes in a more or less manual way. Sometimes we expect to do that at some point in time in a very automatic way, but basically to get all this information. And I'm saying that because, as you know, we have been doing that with several companies, and it's always a challenge. It's always a surprising challenge to ask for the data. Many companies, they have the data very granular, but they don't have all the data about the whole supply chain in a summary way that we could use. So there is some work to be done precisely in order to use those tools. But we integrate that in the sense to use already what is in the company.
So Marcel, you have been working at Philips and J&J in the past, and probably this kind of Excel spreadsheet with a lot of numbers. But these are not the way to present it to a board. If you have to make decisions, you have to put it differently. So how would you like to present it, and what is the new way how to present these options?
Yeah, I think referring to what Carlos is saying, these are great tools, but these are tools for the experts. And I had the luxury and the pleasure to work with very excellent teams with a lot of experience in using this kind of tools. But if you come with this, and I've been on the board of different divisions as a supply chain leader, you're not going to, let's say, make a difference at the board. What we normally try to do, and that's also what Carlos and I are now doing with this tool. We say, okay, you take a company, you understand how it is set up in divisions, you understand what kind of brands are under it, and then you try to understand what are your, call it, power product families, and stop there first to make these strategic decisions based on what's happening on the outside world. If you then, and I make a distinction between three different type of actions. One is, I call that the no regret moves. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
With all the information you have, it's always good to do so. The second one are conditional bets. Yeah, it's clear that it is going in this direction. The impact is there, but maybe not that big. And the third one is really, call it opportunity place. You pick up a factory and you bring it over to another place. By the time you want to take this kind of decisions, and I'm also interested in Carlos's opinion, then you want to run the details at this level and using this kind of tools.
So before you get there, I got a remark from the audience. In my company, we moved our clinical supplies materials to Ireland from China. We don't use one manufacturing plant. So this is a move, but then again, is it a wise move, etc.? So, and I think there are probably a lot of decisions being made right now. So how do you deal with it on a board level? What decision to make, and how to present it to a board? Carlos.
Yeah, so I think that these are questions, and there are several questions in the chat that go very much in that direction of saying one of the things are the things that we can do in the short term, other things medium term, other things long term. And what happens, yes, you can do that, but basically there is a cost. I mean, moving things depending on the product that you are, it might take simply days, or it might take weeks, or even might take years. So the issue is precisely we need, and this is why companies are saying, okay, what is the time frame that we are analyzing and what makes sense? And that is where you use precisely these tools to say, okay, what are the short-term actions? We might need to talk with the board about that, probably not too much. What are the medium-term actions that we want to talk with the board because they're investments, and what are the long-term actions that we might need to take? And that basically is a long discussion. And then maybe the recommendation is we need to start to look at that, but we realize there is a time to implement that, and there is a consequence. If later on the situation changes, nothing will, we will make an investment for nothing. This is in some sense, in the long term, one of the things that some companies are doing. This is something which is temporary. The tariff war will end up at some point in time. Let's not do anything. That was the thinking. If you when people started to see some of the tariffs and the issues with the U.S. administration, now it looks like it's not so obvious, and it seems relatively obvious that some tariffs are going to remain. Now, how high is not obvious. So I think that there is basically, as you say, there is, and exactly as Marcel was saying, there's some short-term actions that we need to evaluate and the different scenarios, some medium term and some long term. Now, the comment about let's move from China to Ireland makes a lot of sense if you could do that in a short time and if it's not too expensive. And that's the issue. What happens if we may end up in a scenario if the taxes from Ireland to the US are bigger than the taxes from China? Now it seems inconceivable, but who knows if in a few weeks we have an agreement between the US and China, and we don't have the same agreement or a less favorable agreement between the European Union and the U.S. administration. So this is why I think that those analyses are important.
What I also heard, Marcel, you mentioned in the previous conversation we had, what is the competition doing? And, as a result, you see in Japan, you mentioned it, the rises of logistics service providers going up because the logistics service provider doesn't export to the US anymore. So the ones in Japan have to pay the bill.
Yeah, that was an interesting second order impact.
Effect, yeah.
I didn't see that one coming, but there are logistics service providers in Japan who are increasing prices because they miss business in the US.
Yeah. And even already, with the whole, I wrote a blog about it, because Trump is saying, if you are on a Chinese ship already, you will get a fine, etc. So it will take a lot of turmoil and a lot of insecurity, etc. So you have to take into account so many aspects. You can
Yes.
handle it in an Excel. You cannot handle it in a supply chain network design tool.
Yeah, it's interesting, Martijn, that you mentioned that. And I think I've worked with a lot of people, intelligent people, who were easy with connecting the dots. I think the amount of dots we have to connect these days is extremely exploding.
Yeah.
That we need this kind of tools to help us to let's say still keep the big picture, because let's be clear about one thing. We are not saying you need to immediately react. What we are saying is you have tools to in a fast way to check what's the impact on my supply chain, what's the impact on my business, have that one conversation together with the business leaders, and take conscious decisions, whether it is tactical on the short term or more on the long term. Yeah. And one of the things which for some companies, and it's spanning industry, don't get me wrong here, but the role of value added services might be seen in a different light in the situations which we are currently in. There could well be that companies start moving, let's say, the packaging or the final assembly into more tariff friendly areas. But also think about the reversibility if, in 2 years from now, the world is changing again. I mean, that's the kind of things where with this tool, it can help you to run through it end to end, seeing more second order impacts of things which could happen, and say, okay, what if, and then prepare yourself. And again, like I said before, the one who is the fastest in the thinking is being ahead of competition. Sorry, Martijn.
No. I think what it amazes me, lately, that these kind of tools, these DeepSeek and Claude and you name it, are able to present it in graphs. That is way better and easier to read than the Excel spreadsheets. And here you see different kind of product groups. And what? That's my hobby to talk about activity-based costing and cost to serve and landed cost, because that's a big hurdle in a lot of companies. But now you have some tools where you can play with total landed cost and cost allocation, variable and fixed, to create your activity-based cost, and how robust it is whether or not you're applied to certain product groups. And I think, Carlos, it is also about how to present it and to make the decisions.
That's a very important thing, because exactly as Marcel was saying, there are so many dots and so on that, and I remember the first reports that we got about that, we were 50 pages of report trying to evaluate all the effects. So then the issue is, even we use then GenAI precisely to summarize that and to try to extract the most important factors. But then the issue is precisely how do you present that in such a way that actually you can connect the most important dots and start to have a discussion about making a decision. And I'm saying that because more than this being a tool that is going to tell you what to do, is a tool that helps you to accelerate very fast and the understanding of the situation, the big things, and then to help you to have a discussion about which one is the best decision we might take. Because remember one thing, when we're talking about scenarios, it means we are not sure. It could be a scenario 1 to 22, is this the best action? X scenario 22 to 105, this is the best. And then you need to make some bets. There is no other way. You need to take some risk. And then you need to look at the opportunities and what are the consequences. One of the interesting things is representing that graphically gives you a better understanding of what are the possibilities, what are the consequences, what are the opportunities. So this is why, and this is a typical graph in which we try to say, this is what you will get, this is the total course, this is the final course, this is a component course, and you see a little bit graphically how it affects several of them. And that, I think, is an important part. This is what we had, if you remember, in the architecture, this part about how do you present, what is the user interface, in order precisely to help people to make sense of all of it and to try to help them to think about the best decisions in the given the circumstances.
So we're getting to the end, and we had some questions. I will get to Q&A right after this slide. How would you mention 5-step to deal with all this stuff going on with tariffs? First, don't panic. Second, create a sandbox environment to play with. Then share insight, and that we get about that. And then embrace some transparencies, and then stay curious. So that's what your colleague Howard Yu from IMD Business School mentioned as some takeaways to deal with all this. So how would you summarize, Carlos, what we have mentioned?
So I think that what we have tried a little bit to explain is, first of all, using AI allows you to be very fast in thinking about strategy and develop new strategies, new scenarios, and to try to look at opportunities and to look at the risk. Now, given that there's a lot of changes and very fast, we need to be able to do that very fast. It's the context what is driving. It's not that what we were doing until now was wrong. Absolutely, it was the right thing. The point is that the context has changed so much in such a fast speed that we cannot rely on the old tools that we were using. So the only thing we're doing is let's try to use the old models in new technology like GenAI, so we can do that very fast, exactly as Marcel was mentioning. Then we shift a little bit from traditional planning in traditional legacy approaches, limited scenarios, so on, to let's try to have multimodal analysis. Let's try to have a lot of analysis. We were talking about these secondary effects. There is a lot of them that suddenly people is thinking, oh my goodness, I didn't thought what's going to happen. Think about the typical thing we know very well in supply chain, which is the bullwhip effect. Yeah. What is the consequences of all these sudden changes over the bullwhip effect? You might say, yeah, my goodness, it's going to be tremendous. Then what AI does is this strategic thinking allows us to do that much faster. It's not something that you would say, okay, we need weeks to do that. And traditionally, we need weeks, even months to do all this analysis. And we will do a fantastic, very accurate analysis. Now we need to be approximately right rather than accurately wrong. And then the deliverable of this should be a strategy in the sense of these are the resilient actions you can take. This is specifically for this company. This is what you can do. These are the risks that you have. And these are the generic things that you find. Exactly as Marcel was saying, there are moves that, yes, you might need to do that. There are moves that you would say, well, under these circumstances, this is scenario, this is how it would work, and then this is how it would work. And then where management needs to make a decision and say, okay, given the context, given the options, given the risks, now I understand what's going on. I'm able to connect the dots. That's the decision that we would like to take. So that to me is a little bit what I think right now we need to enlighten, and these tools allow companies to do that much faster. Marcel, what's your take on that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I like what you said, being proximately right. And I think what you try to do here and what we try to do is having the right level of complexity to keep it simple. Yeah, and I see this as a kind of scenario planning on steroids. Important is that we see the business and supply chain conversation as one conversation. I think in today's world, speed isn't a luxury, but speed is the survival, and it gives us. And I'm a strong believer in what I call pragmatic leadership. It gives us fast, credible, and actionable strategies to take decisions as a board, as a company, and as a supply chain organization.
So one of the questions, and we get we have a few minutes left for Q&A. So one of the questions, we should need a compass. And I read an article in the Harvard Business Review about, you have to have the right prompt. So what is the best opportunity for a factory and is, do you want to be the quickest, the cheapest, whatever. So this compass, as you see here on the screen, that changes over time with this tariffs. So that's one of the things. Yes, you should have a compass. One of the questions, and maybe you can answer that, Carlos. No, have we already applied this to the things of Thanksgiving and Christmas now being ordered for this year to this extent? Is it useful already to apply it for you should order stuff already in China for Christmas and the holidays and the end of this year, or how should we look at that?
So the answer, the first one, the first answer question is, have you applied that to Thanksgiving and Christmas? The answer is no. But the other answer is absolutely. We plan to precisely use it for those situations, and it's a very interesting one, because precisely what happens is that when you think about all the products, particularly gifts and things like that, precisely you need to start to think about ordering right now. And this is where we were talking before about the bullwhip effect. It could be a disaster. It could be absolutely enticing, driving that a little bit crazy. But I think that the answer is no, I have not used it. Should we use it? Absolutely yes. And I think that with one of the companies that we're working, probably soon we are going to start to enter in that area of saying, okay, now we are facing Christmas, we are facing Thanksgiving. We know sales are going to go up depending on the product, very high, some of the other products not so high, but the variation. So the answer is no, but absolutely yes, we'll do that in the near future.
So we are out of time, and so there's way much to discuss. Also, the questions coming in, and I have some notes I would like to address. But we're out of time. Sorry to say about that. But the good news is we have an extra 30 minutes right after this. So if you want to have an extended conversation with the three of us, we will be sitting down in the virtual lounge at table 1. So join us if you want to. Right after this, in a minute. So together with Carlos, Supply Chain Movement and IMD and Supply Chain Companions created a mind map about AI and supply chain, making sense of it all. What is happening in the world? How does it impact companies? What are the supply chain challenges? And what are the possible solutions? And we created a roadmap to create a resiliency cockpit. So that's downloadable over here. With this, I would like to thank you, Carlos, for joining us and explaining a lot.
Thank you very much, Martin, for inviting me.
And Marcel, also thank you for your experience, how to apply this. And thank you for joining me.
More than welcome. Thank you, Martijn.
And the audience, thank you for watching either live or with a recording. So there's way much to discuss and to download. I hope you liked it. Thanks for now. And if you want to join us in the virtual lounge right after this, we'll be there in a minute. Thank you for now, and bye-bye.